Hi, everyone. Wow, this is a little different not seeing you all. So I hope you're well. I hope your family is well. My hope is that your company is managing through. I know some of you, it's all different kinds of states of being in companies right now. And it's been really interesting just in my own work, working with a variety of companies, trying to see where everybody's at, what support do they need. This is tough. And I was reminded this morning in a conversation where we are all learners. There's nobody who has this experience. And you all have your areas of expertise, but we are really all learning this. So my hope is that you are finding ways to keep yourself rejuvenated and energized, that you are able to find some moments for your own sanity. Because especially as leaders, people are looking to us these days of how we're going to navigate through this. And I am seeing lots of examples within clients right now of leaders who understand what that takes and leaders who are struggling. And I'm going to attach an article to this email about leadership in critical times. And I would like to add that at least to our discussion as we pull Tier 1 all together next Wednesday. And think about, when we're not just because of this an unprecedented pandemic in most of our lifetimes, unless you're around for the 1918 one, but we don't have anyone in class that old. What does this look like as we navigate? And I started off Tier 1 with the comment in more complex, matrix-driven, volatile, ambiguous times. And here we are. This isn't the first big thing to hit, but this is certainly one of the biggest. So really think about that. A, you got to take care of yourself. B, we need to make sure we're taking care of our teams. Which really leads me to the summary from last week with Connie Huber. So if you weren't able to be there, or even if you were and you just felt like tuning in to see what Selena was up to, I want to talk you through just a couple of key points that my hope is it'll help as we look at the whole coursework of this program and where this fits in. So human resource management, we also need to remember, is not just a department. And I gave that disclaimer in one of our last classes as we were setting up for Connie's session. It's not a department. It is how we take our employees, our humans, and drive performance. So when 60, 70, 80% of your operating costs are people, this stuff matters. And I want you to be familiar with what we call the employee life cycle. So that is everywhere from where we start recruiting and branding and being known in our communities through the recruitment and selection process to after we selected them and they're officially an employee, how we onboard and socialize them to the organization, how we orientate and train them, ideally to get them to performance faster. And then the life cycle continues with that employee relationship, how we set expectations, how we help people be successful, how we lead them, how we create teams with them in them. What we also recognize during that life cycle, there are areas which are typically what we look at in a lot of the common HR, legal requirements, right, which guide us all the way through that employment relationship. Compensation and benefits, personnel planning, training and development, performance management, and learning and growth, right? Learning and development opportunities. And then how that entire lifespan gets us to the fact that eventually everybody leaves, right? Whether that sounds a little weird, but eventually you leave. Either the business shuts down or you retire or you resign or the employer disengages with you, right? And releases you from employment, but eventually everybody leaves. So if we think about that from an organizational life cycle standpoint and how the employee fits into that, what we really recognize today, and interestingly enough, I would have said this before COVID-19, when we understand that people are a critical part of our strategic plan, when we understand that people have a significant impact on how we survive as a business. Ultimately, of course, as any type of business, we have to make money. We don't make money, we're not in business anymore. But people have such a profound impact on our ability to be successful and be able to hit those objectives. So I really want you to consider HR as a strategic advantage. Certainly, the department itself has moved from the personnel department of the 60s and 70s and even some of the 80s into this idea of human resource management, even to some kind of later descriptions of how we take care of people and people care policies and how we engage our workforce. But it truly does remain one of a business's best strategic advantages. So we recognize that employee life cycle, recruitment, hiring, employee relations, and organizational development, how we manage performance, whether that's discipline, reinforcement, rewards, and ultimately succession planning. When people leave, how do we make sure that business continuity continues so that the business itself has sustainability? And one of the ways we do that is succession planning. So who can do what when somebody leaves, or how can we plan for that as organizations shift and grow and people age or new opportunities come up for our business? So really thinking about this HR material as you look at your handout, it's so important to have a common understanding of the laws governing human resources, what recruitment techniques your companies are using, how to interview people. Think about some of the ways that you've learned to interview others and maybe what's illegal to ask, or how you get the best answer, because we have all met some professional interviewers who give us the answer we exactly want to know, but that may not get us to a good hiring decision. Even thinking about that role of coaching and performance management, being able to give feedback, but then also understanding if we have to separate from employment, what does that look like? And I'm always reminding, especially new supervisors, or if it's the first time, maybe you've been a leader for a long time, but you're discharging, you're terminating employment for your first employee. I've always said throughout my career, and I don't know how many hundreds of people I've had to release from employment over the last 27 years of HR. I've always said I want to be able to sleep at night. I want to know that as a company, we set clear expectations, we gave people the resources to be successful, but ultimately we held them accountable. And a termination decision from employment should never be a surprise. It should always be something that while the employee may still deny it, there's still a piece there, we know we've done what we could do. And just how we plan for that. So if we are going to expand in the coming years, do we have the inside talent or do we need to bring talent from the outside? When are the advantages for us to promote from within? And what are the advantages or disadvantages for us to hire from outside? All of those kinds of things we need to think about with succession planning. So if we consider first just a few of those early points on laws that are impacting you every day, at least want you aware of these. Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA. If you haven't heard about it, you're about to hear about it a lot more because we now have an emergency Family Medical Leave Act for the COVID virus. The original, so I don't want to go into that right now because honestly, all the stuff on that is changing daily. But the FMLA was put in place it's really job protection. If you want to think FMLA is job protection, it gives me the opportunity to get certified by a physician if I have a serious health condition or someone that I am caretaker for has a serious health condition. It protects my job. It doesn't pay me. It's not a paid leave unless I have PTO in place, paid time off. So FMLA gets complicated when I can take it intermittently. So your role as a supervisor, if you're not in HR, your role as a supervisor is to make sure employees are aware of their rights, because there is a burden of proof on the employer that we let people know that they have a right to take FMLA if, as an organization, we have 50 or more employees. So as a supervisor, if I have an employee who's missing time because I know they're taking care of their sick mother in their home and they can't get to work right now, but I'm not offering them FMLA, then that's on us. And so employees certainly should be educated about and should know about this, but we have to tell them about it. We still run into cases where maybe, I know this employee's trying, but man, they're missing too much work. And now I release them based on something that should have been protected by FMLA. There are bigger punitive damages that can come from that. So FMLA, even for any of us in HR who dealt with this for years, I still look it up every single time. There are too many nuances that every case is different. Intermittent, where I can take an hour here and an hour here and an hour here, is a supervisor's nightmare, but it's protected by law. I look up the stuff every single time because I want to make sure we're doing the right thing for the company. And really what I want you to think about is how you hone that gut instinct for, something's up with this question. This employee just asked me this and I need to check this out. And that's when you need to access your HR or your manager, another source of information, because something's just up. And that goes for even some of the other laws too. The Americans with Disabilities Act, as amended, certainly looks at the fact that we have a responsibility to employ people with all different types of abilities. This is where you've heard some of the phrases of what are the essential work functions of a job, and are you able to perform the essential functions of this job? And because I can't discriminate based on ability, if with reasonable accommodation we could make it work. And reasonable accommodation can't be defined clearly legally, but it really is stating a case that says, you know what, with a few modifications that are reasonable for the employer, we could have this person as a contributing employee in our organization. So again, we can't be dismissive. And I got a prediction for you. We've had to do some pretty major adjustment in the last couple of weeks because of COVID. And I firmly believe that once we come out of COVID, this accessibility and accommodation world is going to look different, because we've had to push a lot of things into doing things differently. And many of our peoples with disability could work if employers were willing to work with some accommodation. So think about that. Civil Rights Act was certainly one of our cornerstone significant pieces of legislation that prohibited discrimination based on what we call protected classes. And you know them as race, religion, ethnicity, veteran status, right? And it depends if you look at the national statute, the state statutes, or even there are some local statutes that add in what I'll call categories of people. Now, there are all different kinds of ways to look at those, but really, if you think about it, from the 1960s, when that first Civil Rights Act was enacted, we have really been trying to undo unjust actions that had been taken. And let me give you one example to that still rings so true with me. A number of years ago, we were moving, those big old metal filing cabinets in the back of an office. We were moving one, and man, there was old stuff back there, and it was dirty and crumpled paper and old file boxes. And crumpled in the back of one of those old heavy rusted metal filing cabinets was a couple of pages ripped out from an employee handbook, personnel handbook from 1972, I think was the date. And it said this: if you get pregnant, you're fired. That was 1972. It was still legal. Many of us were on this earth in 1972. Not all of us were, but I was. 1972, it was still legal to put in a handbook, if you get pregnant, you're fired, because the Pregnancy Discrimination Act did not come until the later 1970s. So we need to understand why we make the decisions we do. What do we base our selection, hiring, right? Selection and hiring, promotion, pay decisions based on? And it really has to be back to that person's ability to do the essential functions of the job. National Labor Relations Act should just be something you're familiar with. If you work in in an environment where collective bargaining is present, you are aware of it. As leaders, we cannot prohibit organizing activity. So if you are working in an organization where there is not a collective bargaining unit or union, if you catch wind of it, we can't say, oh, you can't do that. No, they have the right to organize. Now, there are some responses a company can take. And while there are certainly many reasons why collective bargaining units exist and why unions and union contracts have been needed and been around for so long, it certainly is a very difficult, can be a very difficult conversation in an organization where representation or organization is starting to happen. If you've lived with it for a long time, you know that there are difficulties in that relationship, and that relationship becomes really important for how we bargain and how we get along to get work done on a day-to-day basis. So if you don't have union as part of your background, just good to be aware of the National Labor Relations Act and in general what unions and union organizing looks like. It's just good professional information to understand. All right? Comments, questions? You can't answer me, so no, I'm kidding. All right. So let's talk about that employment process. So recruiting and hiring, some things we want to think about is where we're recruiting from. Where will we get our best candidates? So in HR, we look at pipeline. How do we get the word out on what websites, on what locations? How do we cultivate an employee pool? So we've got a lot of organizations that work with Kirkwood to go into the middle schools and the high schools to cultivate a future workforce. All sorts of things that can happen in sourcing and recruiting employees. And that definitely has a distinct difference in high unemployment versus low unemployment. We also need to be clear on what key skills and abilities are we looking for. When a position is vacant, it is your best opportunity to redesign that position. Really hard to do with somebody in it. So if a position is vacated for whatever reason, and you don't have another like position with it, it's your best time to figure out, well, I don't know, what should we be hiring for? What are we looking for? And just really being aware of that. That's your best time. What kind of candidate are we looking for? What are those competencies? What are those abilities, those skill sets that we need? We do know that there are some ups and downs with social media references these days, just being aware of that recruiting and hiring. Courts have really said, hey, employers, if you are not supposed to ask the question in an interview, you really shouldn't be able to Google it either. So if you were interviewing me for a job and you couldn't ask me, hey, Selena, how old are your kids? Are you going to have daycare issues getting here? Because these hours don't coordinate with school. Okay, there's so many things wrong with that question and so many illegal parts of that. But if you can't ask that to me, the courts have really ruled with candidates that you shouldn't also be able to go Google it out, bring up my Facebook profile, or other online information on me to say, oh, she has little kids. I don't know if she's going to be a good fit for this position. You shouldn't be able to Google it either. So be aware of that. We see some differences with LinkedIn. If your company says that you should not be giving out references on past employees, but you give them a reference on LinkedIn, just recognize, are you representing the company or is that directly to you? Just watch for the ways that social media play into that. Certainly, recruiting and hiring has been, in a very tight labor market, a tremendous challenge. So, it'll be interesting to see in the ways that changes coming up and what we need to do to make sure that we're recruiting a really viable workforce. All right. So I'm going to pause for just a minute. I'll be right back with you. All right, I'm back. Of course, you can pause this anytime you want. Excuse me. So behavior-based interviewing is just a good practice to be aware of. Behavior-based interviewing, for those of you who are involved in the interviewing process, behavior-based interviewing really came out of some research that said using questions to inquire about past behavior is probably a good way to predict what their future behavior will be, just so we can understand how they process it, the decisions they made, how they explain that past behavior. Chances are you've answered a behavior-based question in your background. So some things that I want you to be aware of when it comes to HR and consistently executing HR responsibilities in your role is that I want you to have a standard set of questions that you're interviewing all candidates on. You can dig deeper. You can ask probing questions. You can always add on as long as they're legal questions, but you need to consistently ask people the same thing. So you're comparing apples to apples, if you will. I want you to listen more than you talk in an interview. You want to hear from the candidate. If you've ever been on an interview where the interviewer did all the talking and you're like, I don't know, I didn't get to say much. That's not a great thing. We also want to think about realistic job preview. So realistic job preview is where I get to check the company out and I really get to see how this company functions. You're not going to get all into the nitty gritty dirty stuff, but I need to see the job clear enough to make sure this is a fit for me. So we want to think about fit. As an interviewer, I want to make sure you want to work here and I want to make sure you should work here. Because when we are too quick to hire, it is much easier not to hire them and minimize our risk as an employer. But once we hire them, it is much harder to exit them. So really taking time in that upfront interview multiple times, interview in multiple ways. We see more with email responses these days because people are doing a lot of writing, phone interviews, video interviews, especially right now, peer interviews. It's interesting. Candidates will say things to people who they perceive will be their peers on the job way more than they'll tell you as a potential supervisor. So if you have trained peer interviewers who we use them because we want their input in the process, it is also interesting. Candidates tend to open up a little bit more to them. Now, I will share with you my least favorite question, and that is, tell me a little bit about yourself. As soon as I ask you to tell me a little bit about yourself, you can now tell me about anything you want to. And some people have no filter. The problem is that once you've disclosed that to me, I am now legally responsible for not hiring you based on anything that you might have told me I could use for discriminatory purposes. So it's just good to be aware of. Now, I prefer the question, tell me a little bit about your experience and how you feel like it connects to this position. Part of the reason we open with a question like that is to help put the candidate at ease, because when the candidate is more at ease, they're more likely going to interview more accurately. So I love putting candidates at ease. I want them to talk open and freely. But if I say, hey, tell me a little bit about yourself, I may not want to know some of that. And you can ask me next time some bad interview stories, but chances are we've all had them in this class. So once you've hired them, right, you've made your choice. Even if you have 5 candidates that are a great fit, you still may only have one position open. So I always talk about fit. I want to offer the position to the person that I believe will be the best fit. Even if I have 5 strong candidates or 2 strong candidates, we know the risk is that if I don't have any strong candidates and I still need to hire someone, we have a tendency in a tight labor market to just hire them and see if it works out. You just have to be able to assess the risk. What does that put you at risk of? Might be okay, might not be okay. So once we've hired them, we know that that employment process is just critical. Communication, making sure that we build it on respect and trust and not just swoop in and gotcha, right? That we check for our assumptions and how important our words are. That we coach and we model and we teach people. It kind of makes me wonder some days so I'll be working with a client and they say, well, but we trained our employees on that. I'm like, oh, so when did you train them? Well, when they started, we told them all that. Oh, good. So how long ago did this person start? Oh, 18 months ago, 3 years ago. How well do you remember your first day on the job, right? Unless it was really good or really bad, there's just so much thrown at us. So really thinking about how do you coach your employees to performance? That's HR, folks. You're doing it every day. You're taking care of your people to drive performance. So giving performance feedback, asking questions, listening are all really important parts to human resource management. If you don't want to be an HR manager, I don't want you to be an HR manager. But you also need to recognize that in your role as a leader, you have HR responsibilities every single day. We do know that employment process can be a couple of hours or a couple of decades and longer. So it is different for everybody. Your relationships change, people change over time. And really just think about your own employer practices of once they bring someone in, what's that look like? How long do people stay? How committed are they? How engaged are they? Are there opportunities to move either laterally in an organization or up? How do people view working for that organization? Are they proud of it, or do they kind of hover when they say, oh, that's where I work? Really think about some of those aspects for your organization and what is the status of human resource management in your business? Right now, given a pandemic and all the seriousness and all the really tough weeks we have coming ahead, it might look different. I would also suggest to you that we come through this, business is going to look different. We're not going back. Can't go back to pre-COVID. So what does this look like as we come out of this? I want you as leaders to really consider how we get ready to lead for what comes next. What does that employment relationship look like? People who don't feel cared for right now may not stick around at that employer. And when we're looking at 30% unemployment potentially as we get through this, and again, those are stats out there. I don't say that stat to scare anybody, but we expect a seismic shift of who's employing, where they're employing. And when we're looking at that, and there are plenty of candidates out there to hire, which I know after what we've had the last few years just doesn't even seem possible. I want our organizations to do well. I want us to do well as leaders. And it's going to take some creative thinking to really consider, how do we care for people during this time? How do we come out of this as sustainable and stronger, if at all possible? Let's take a few minutes and make sure that we talk about that discharge process. So certainly someone can retire, right? Probably one of the supervisor errors that I still see is someone saying, so you thinking about retirement soon? No, don't ask it. Illegal. Don't ask it. You cannot say to one of your team members, and when you think they are becoming of a certain age, hey, so you got any retirement plans? Let them bring it up. You can talk about operations planning. You can talk about product lines coming up, and would they have interest in maybe training for that, if that's something you want to talk about. But you cannot ask them if they're thinking about retiring soon. There you will find yourself in an age discrimination discussion. Termination should never be a surprise, right? Separating someone from employment is hard. And for anybody who ever says it's easy to me, I want to see them in counseling right away. Because you're impacting someone's life. And that's why I want you to be really clear on the expectations you place, the process you go through, and making sure that you can still release someone from employment with dignity. When you hit that termination discussion, the decision is already made. This is not up for debate, right? So it's usually short to the point. I always want two people in there. If I am the discharging supervisor, I want HR with me. Usually, and if you don't have an HR person, I want another manager or supervisor in there with me, because I don't want to be the one walking them to the door. I want somebody else to walk with them so they can't pick at me all the way out, especially if I'm expecting some anger. I also don't want you in a small office in the corner of a plant with one other person and unsafe. So as somebody who has had to call the authorities, I've had my tire slashed, those are other stories. Some things don't go well. And I never want you in that kind of vulnerable position. I don't care how big you are. I don't care how strong you are. You just never know. And so I always have somebody outside of the office that knows something's happening in my office and that they're on watch. I want those kinds of safeguards in place. And again, hopefully we do this well and people exit, but then, some of the shock and denial hit when they get home. So I want them to have some material with them to know, when did they say I'm getting my last check? What if I forgot something at work? What about my COBRA benefits, right? I want them to have that information in hand so that then when they go home and they start processing, which is also why I believe Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock is not the best time to release someone from employment, because then they have all evening and the weekend to often get upset or ask questions. And if nobody is there or off shifts are there and may not have as much management coverage, then I'm putting other people at risk. It is something that we need to be aware of. Most of the time goes okay. I just don't want even one of those times to not go okay for you. So legal risks, we just need to know the key concept with HR and employment today is employment at will. That unless you're under a contract, right? Unless you're under a contract, you're an employee at will, meaning, and contract being you're going to work for me for 9 months at this rate of pay. Employment at will is you can quit anytime. You're not bound by some date on a contract. I can fire you at any time. And I just have to be able to prove as an employer that it was for a legal reason. So that becomes really important to make sure that if we fire someone, we have a legal reason. You can fire someone at any time for any reason. They just also have the right to sue you at any time for any reason. And I'm saying that with some jest, but it's true. So that's where documentation becomes really important. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. You need to take notes, good, bad, otherwise. You need to take consistent notes. That's where you need to follow your own process. A lot of the unemployment hearings or discrimination claims or any other type of post-employment claim often come back to lack of documentation. Well, the performance appraisal given 2 weeks before their dismissal said they were doing fine. What changed? Or no notes. You just have to be clear and consistent. And you have to watch for your risk factors. So if I have a performance concern with a 62-year-old on my team and we've talked about it and I've documented it, they've not gotten a raise, they've had poor performance evaluations, and I go through my process and I discharge them from employment, they could come back with an age discrimination suit through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a different conversation. They could make a claim on age that I discriminated them based on age, but I would have to prove we didn't. And it's harder if I have no notes and then I replace their position with a 24-year-old. I'm going to have to prove it wasn't for age. And it may not have been, but if I burden of proof is always on the employer. So that becomes really important in your notes, in your consistency, and in that post-employment claim, they will always say, did you do what your policy said you did? Because if we don't even follow our own policy, we lose a lot of credibility. So those legal risks, we want to make sure we're not retaliating. Oh, I was on the phone with an employee earlier today who said, I feel like I've been retaliated against. And as soon as that word comes up, flags go up, because somebody who feels like if I made a complaint and now I feel like I'm being punished for it, retaliation for juries usually ups the award by millions. So we really want to make sure that as a supervisor, if somebody filed a complaint, that we are treating them fairly and consistently and that we're not holding it against them. So, it's one of those things with legal that in one of my last senior HR positions, when I was more I was just closer with the 3 attorneys than I was most of my colleagues. I knew I spent way too much time with the 3 attorneys in 3 states asking questions. So legal is a huge part of the HR department purpose because that's the environment we live in. It is a legal environment. So we need to make sure that people get due process. You'll see that term in your handout. That's where we need a good step investigation. People will more likely receive a verdict that is against them if they feel like the process was fair. So if I feel like I was heard and you investigated it, I may not like your answer, but there's a better chance of me accepting it if I feel like the process was fair. So look at that due process piece. It also needs to be consistent, right? What have we done in previous cases like this? If it was discrimination or harassment or unfair schedule changes, what have we done? And really making sure that we continue to make consistent decisions. Really just comes back to making sure we're communicating expectations. And if we've not been doing it, then you kind of need to draw a line in the sand and let your employee know going forward, Here's what's changed. Here's how I'll help. Here are the resources available to you, but this is what I need you to do. And then the decision is up to them. But I need to make sure I set them up for success, and I'm not just trying to paperwork them out. There are all types of people in this world. And, to some extent, as leaders, we kind of need to like people. You may not be really fond of people right now, and that kind of sounds funny in a social isolation, physical isolation. But as leaders, we need to meet people at where they're at and bring them with us. And we have just a huge responsibility to take good care of people and recognize that there are just all types, right? Some people are going to irritate you. Some people you just wish you had more like them. But really think about how you're driving results with your people right now, through your people. And yes, there are logistics to HR management, recruitment, selection, hiring, compensation. Got to pay them fairly. I can't just pay this person that and that person that. I need to make sure that I'm doing it for lawful reasons. I need to make sure I'm clear and consistent with my communication, that I am a good employer. And if I want to be an employer of choice, what does that look like? I need to make sure that if this relationship ends, I do so in a responsible legal way that preserves what might be today's ex-employees, tomorrow's customer, right? We live in communities that are more and more connected, and professional reputation follows us. I want you known for good things. So thank you for tuning in for this time. My hope is that maybe for those of you who attended, you got a little bit more of the Selena twist to some of that material. That if you weren't able to attend, this just gave you some things to think about. And I would welcome, if you want to email me questions, we'll tie this into our last Tier 1 session, that if there are questions from the group, this is called Stump Your Instructor. Give me some scenarios, give me some questions you don't think I can answer. We'll see what we do with that. But anyways, be well, stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you all online at this very space with this screen, with my stuff behind me next week. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon.